What was Paul accused of when he went to the temple in Acts 21? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 21, verses 26 to 40, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 21, verse 26, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 21, beginning at verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, and laid hands on him, crying out, "Man of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple, and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple. And immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commanders came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hands to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, Paul is in Jerusalem with James and the elders in Jerusalem, telling them of his work among the Gentiles. They advised him to go to the temple with 4 men from among them, who had taken what looks to be a Nazirite vow, and pay for their expenses for the purification that was outlined in Numbers 6. The reason they did this is because some of the Jewish Christians had come to understand that not only was Paul teaching the Gentiles not to follow the law of Moses, which the Jews had been taught in Acts 15 was the correct teaching, but he was also teaching the Jews to not follow any part of the law of Moses either. What Paul in fact had been teaching is that the law of Moses played no part in their salvation. They were justified by grace received through obedient faith in Jesus. But because the law had been given by God, the parts that did not have to do with salvation, parts like certain vows, feast days, circumcision, and meats, the Jewish Christians were at liberty to keep or not keep. If they chose to keep them, they could not do so thinking they were obtaining salvation by practicing those things, but they could do so as part of their cultural heritage. And since this law was not part of the Gentiles' cultural heritage, since the law was given to the Jews alone, that is why the Jewish Christians couldn't bind such practices on the Gentile Christians. On its face, the advice of James and the elders of the Jerusalem church seemed wise, for if Paul showed that he wasn't against the Jews following parts of the law of Moses as a cultural practice, then perhaps some of the tension that had arisen not only among the Jewish Christians, but the Jews in general, could be eased. But as we said at the end of the last lesson, it does not appear that the Holy Spirit had guided these men in this case, for the events that followed proved not to ease tensions, but to inflame them more. Since it was not sinful, though, Paul, wanting to ensure that he was not offending any Christian from following Christ or any Jew from becoming a Christian, decided to heed the advice of James and the elders and accompany those men to the temple for purification and pay for their expenses. On the screen now is a model of the temple in Jerusalem. In the court of the temple, on either side of the temple itself, is what is called the court of the Gentiles. It is here and here alone that the Gentiles are allowed to congregate. On either side of the temple structure, the Jews had constructed balustrades or low fences with warnings posted that the Gentiles could pass no further. Inside the inner courts of the temple was the court of women, followed by the innermost court where the sacrifices were offered, a court which leads to the temple itself. No Gentile was to enter the inner court, but Paul, being a Jew, could enter along with these men. But this being Pentecost meant that Jews from around the globe were present in Jerusalem, including Jews from Asia who would recognize Paul. Recall back from Paul's second and third preaching trips, the Jews had been harassing him in most cities that he went to, for what he preached about was Jesus, and they disagreed with that. On this occasion, though, they sought to stir up trouble a different way, by not only accusing Paul of teaching against the law, but also bringing Trophimus the Ephesian, a Gentile that accompanied Paul back in chapter 20, into the inner courts of the temple and defiling it. Paul had done no such thing, and from the language of the text, it appears that these Jews who made the charge knew that, merely doing so in order to have Paul arrested and killed. Bringing a Gentile into the temple was a big thing, and so this caused an uproar in the city. Those in the temple dragged Paul out of the temple and closed the doors to prevent him from returning should he escape. A riot ensued, and those involved began beating Paul for what they thought he had done. News of this riot quickly came to the commander of the garrison in Jerusalem, and so he sent soldiers down to quell the riot. Word likely got to the commander so quickly because the Antonia fortress, which housed Roman troops, overlooked the Temple Mount, and so the events going on there could be seen from the fortress. The riot stopped when the soldiers arrived for fear of what those soldiers would do. Paul, though, was bound by the Romans, just as Agabus had prophesied earlier in the chapter, and they inquired who Paul was and what he had done. Note, the Roman soldiers immediately assumed that Paul was at fault, even though he wasn't, but people don't always act justly. We need to remember that. The crowd who rioted thought that they would help identify who Paul was, but they couldn't agree as to what Paul had done. This just goes to show you that people join riots without fully understanding the circumstances, simply because that's what everyone else is doing. As a Christian, we should not be doing this. We should not be rioting to begin with, but we shouldn't simply do something because everyone else is doing it. When the truth couldn't be ascertained, Paul was taken to the barracks, which would have been the Antonia fortress. The violence of the mob persisted in some regards, though, for Paul had to be carried up the stairs of the fortress by the soldiers, due to the crowd yelling for Paul to be taken away. As we come to verse 37, we come to another point in Scripture where chapters and verses are placed in weird places. For not only does the chapter end in the middle of a sentence, but in reality, verses 37 to the end of the chapter really belong in chapter 22. In the barracks, though, Paul wanted to speak to the commander. The commander of the fortress probably was surprised that Paul spoke Greek, for he thought that Paul was an Egyptian who some time ago had caused a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness. Now this Egyptian is unnamed, but Josephus, in his accounts of the history and wars of the Jews, does mention a man who fits very closely with this description. In Josephus' writing, this Egyptian came from Egypt to Jerusalem and said that he was a prophet and advised the multitude of the common people to go with him to the Mount of Olives. He said further that he would show them from thence how the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, and he promised them that he would procure for them an entrance through those walls when they were fallen down. Josephus adds in Jewish Wars that he got about 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place. But Felix, who was apprised of his movements, marched against him with the Roman soldiers and defeated him, and killed 400 of them, and took 200 alive. But the Egyptian escaped himself out of the fight, but did not appear any more. That was from Josephus. Since Felix is mentioned by Josephus, Felix being a man we're about to meet in Acts, the time period fits. And so if this Egyptian described by Josephus is the same man referred to here in Acts, then of course it would make sense why Paul was thought to be this man, and a riot to have ensued. Paul, though, says that he is a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a city that is not obscure or undistinguished. In fact, Tarsus at that time was celebrated for its learning. Paul wanted to speak to the Jewish people and was given permission by the commander to do so. We're going to find out what he said, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 22, verses 1 to 11, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.